Hello, everyone. Welcome to This Week in Global Health. This week, we talk about gender-based violence. And as you can see, it's an all-women's panel this time. And the reason is Greg is actually sick. He's not well. He's down with laryngitis. But as a result, we have an all-women's panel talking about gender-based violence. So to start with, we'll be talking about the 16 days of activism to end violence against women. And we have some new members on the show. So to start with, Catherine, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name's Catherine Dunlop. I'm coming to you from Uppsala, which is just north of Stockholm in Sweden. And I'm really happy to be here. This is my first panel, and I'm excited.
Great to have you, Catherine. We also have Koslai. It's also her first time on the show. So Kosi, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Koslai Mohan. So I come from Greenwich, Connecticut, which is north of New York City. I'm glad to be here.
Fantastic. And we also have Sanskriti, who you may have seen on our show before, and Sarah Weber, who also takes charge of TWiGH blog. So if you have any blog posts, she's a person to write to. So quickly to start the show, we're highlighting 16 days of activism, as I said. So Sarah, can you shed more light on what this campaign is all about?
Yes, so the 16 Days of Activism Against GBV, it runs between 25th of November, which is the International Day for Elimination of Violence Against Women, and December 10th, and that is the International Human Rights Day. And this whole campaign is to really push the dialogue and conversation about the issue of gender-based violence, and this is the 24th year of the campaign.
Fantastic. And the theme for this year is Orange the World, to make it brighter and better for women and to ensure gender equality, so women and transgender. So to remind our listeners, gender-based violence is not only physical, sexual, or emotional abuse. It also includes female infanticide, forced marriage, child marriage, female genital mutilation, or trafficking, and exploitation on the basis of gender. And just as a reminder, another additional reminder, we had another episode on gender-based violence that we aired in May. So the link of the episode will be on the show notes and in the video, so do check it out. And we're also doing a 16 fast facts session on Twitter. So if you have a fast fact on gender-based violence that you would like to share with our team, please send it to us. So for this particular episode, though, we'll be talking interventions. But before we get into that, what exactly is the difference between gender-based violence and violence against women? So I get asked that a lot. So to start with, Sanskriti, can you tell us what the difference is?
Absolutely. So these terms are often used interchangeably, as most gender-based violence is inflicted by men on women and girls. But this term extends beyond just the categories of male and female and is attributed to any violence that occurs against an individual based on one's gender.
Definitely, great point. It's really important not to forget transgender, for whom violence and stigma is often a daily fact of life. In fact, 75 countries continue to criminalize same-sex relationships, and up to 10 countries have death penalty for homosexual conduct. However, since it's an all-women panel today, we'll be talking more about violence against women. So, Kosi, can you give me some facts on how common is gender-based violence for women?
Sure, Susan. So worldwide, 1 in 3 women experience some form of gender-based violence. So it's fairly common. Surprisingly, up to 70% of women experience physical or sexual violence by an intimate partner at some point in their lives.
My God, startling number, 70%. So since we talk about intimate partner relationships, and diving very quickly into what's being done currently to highlight women's rights and advocacy against gender-based violence, Sarah, could you give us some examples on what efforts are being made worldwide for gender-based violence to end violence against women?
Yes, so this whole campaign, the 16 Days of Activism campaign, has really elevated discussions around GBV. It's really gotten leaders speaking about it. And for example, the Liberian President Sirleaf has called for stronger, effective community action involving campaigns at home, at schools, in churches, and different organizations around sexual and gender-based violence. So it's really elevated the discussions.
I'm glad you bring gender-based violence in Liberia into focus, Sarah, because Liberia, incidentally, has a really high rate of gender-based violence at 96.7%. It is a country that has seen a lot of conflict in the past. And the reason the two are interlinked is because countries in conflict usually have a higher rate of violence against women. In fact, there was a study done of 50 countries where they showed that gender-based violence and violence against women significantly increases following major wars. So the link of that study will also be in our show notes. Please do check it out.
Yeah, and actually, if we look at some current conflicts, in the Syrian conflict right now, fear of sexual violence has been cited as the main reason that women are fleeing the country. And it's pretty hard to combat gender-based violence in Syria because of the unstable political situation and how difficult it is to get actors to cooperate. But there are efforts to combat it, many of which utilize media and journalism as forms of advocacy and awareness building. Women Under Siege is an organization who've developed a crowdsourced map where incidents of sexual violence have been reported. So that's a really interesting innovation, actually.
Definitely. Sanskriti, you have a comment?
Yeah, well, I mean, I was actually just going to remind our viewers that if you want more information about exactly what role gender-based violence plays in these refugee camps, just look at the fast facts that we put up on our Twitter page, and you'll have more information just to kind of supplement what we're talking about today.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Sanskriti. So, Kasi, I understand you have some information for us as well on what efforts are being made worldwide to combat gender-based violence.
Yes, as part of the 16 days, there was also an African Girls Summit on ending child marriage held in Zambia from 26th and 27th November, and a forum by African Development Bank in Abidjan, Cote d'Ivoire, to discuss issues of child marriage and female genital mutilation. This is key as it shows greater commitment from African Union as well as African Development Bank and civil societies to end practices of child marriage and female genital mutilation. And be sure to check the link, so we have added in our show note link page.
And actually, if we look at Africa as an example of ways that we can help women, there are some quite interesting things going on in refugee camps. So maybe not necessarily in countries of conflict presently, but in neighboring countries. One example is in Rawanda at the Mahama refugee camp, which is home to over 45,000 refugees. And they're aiming to curb gender-based violence with educational theatre. So the theatre pieces are performed both by Rwandan artists and Burundian refugees. Now the performances are dubbed Mwetera go Mwetere, which literally translated means don't create any additional trouble while in trouble. Actually, I hope you excuse my pronunciation of that. If we have any Rwandan people watching, feel free to tweet me how to say that properly, because I'm pretty sure I butchered it. Feel free to use the hashtag don't butcher my language.
Definitely a great point there, Catherine. I understand you also have like a piece on how, laws are being implemented, as part of this campaign across the world to combat gender-based violence. Could you tell us a little bit more on that?
Yeah, totally. One really good example of how advocacy is changing laws is actually in Brazil. Brazil's president signed a new law in March of this year, which set out really tough new penalties for femicide, which is the murder or killing of women and girls, because at the time in Brazil, gender crimes resulted in the murder of, on average, 15 women a day, which is really shocking. We'll also have an article about that in the show notes, so you can read a bit more.
That's definitely a really high number indeed. But as we talk about, gender-based violence and violence against women, it's important to involve men. Violence against women is closely related to rigid norms that define what it is to be a man, and that often affects behavior and violence towards women. And this is why we need to involve men in solutions. So, Sanskriti, you have a comment with regards to, how can we involve men?
Right. So there's actually something called the White Ribbon Campaign that was started in Canada in the year 1991. And this campaign engages boys and men to wear a white ribbon in solidarity to never commit, excuse, or remain silent about men's violence against women. In fact, the White Ribbon Campaign is one of the largest male-led campaigns against gender-based violence. So that's really interesting.
Fantastic. And since we mentioned Canada, I also understand you have a number for us on the cost of gender-based violence for Canada.
Yes, I do, Susan. So the cost of GBV is actually quite significant in society. It costs about $1.6 billion a year, including medical care and productivity loss. But I believe you have the US statistics for that as well, just to add to what I have to say.
Definitely, like huge costs of gender-based violence, medical treatment and loss of productivity. In US, annually, the cost of gender-based violence amounts to $8.3 billion. So definitely, like a really big push needs to be made to combat gender-based violence. So since we're talking about men, Sarah, do you have any information on, are there any organizations working towards changing the sort of patriarchal conditioning, as I call it, attitude towards violence against women?
Certainly. So there's a lot of local organizations that are trying to focus now more on enabling men to be actively advocating against domestic violence or gender-based violence. And one I wanted to highlight is in Rwanda. Rwanda has an organization called the Rwanda Men's Resource Center, or more commonly called Positive Masculinities. And this NGO really works to promote gender equity and prevent gender-based violence for Rwanda's development. And they hold trainings that are focused on sensitizing men towards gender equity and developing or challenging traditionally held notions and beliefs.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Sarah, because this kind of conditioning that the man is a man if he's surviving, and a woman's job is a woman's job. It starts pretty early too, and there is an effort being made in India, in fact, called Revolve, which talks about how at a really young age there are already biases for men and women, boys and girls, and there's an effort being made to change that. I understand, Catherine, you have a comment?
Yeah, I was thinking while we were talking about kind of trying to get men empowered in this, there's obviously the big He for She campaign as well, which has kind of been fronted up by Emma Watson. I'm sure most of our viewers have heard of that already, but I just thought I'd throw that in there while we're talking about this.
Definitely. Sanskruti, you have a comment too?
Yeah, so I was just going to say that a lot of gender-based violence activism is actually attempting to alter the structural institutions within society that promote this gender-based violence against women, as opposed to altering individual people's perceptions about it. And the example that you gave about Revolve in India, like those kind of campaigns actually change the attitudes and stereotypes about gender in society with a specific violence. With a specific focus, rather, on stopping violence against women. So,
great point there. And one of the tools I believe that is very useful in changing perceptions and attitudes is fashion and art. So, Kosi, I believe you have a piece on how fashion and art can help.
Yes, yeah. Fashion and art help to engage men too, not only for girls, as they have universal appeal. One example is Priya Shakti, a comic book where the protagonist is a rape victim survivor who, along with Hindu goddess Parvati, fights gender-based violence in India.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Kosi. This is a fantastic comic, so if you haven't seen it, definitely check out. The link will be there in the show notes and the video. So Priya Shakti, incidentally, the protagonist in the comic, was voted by UN Women as Gender Equality Champion. So definitely a really fantastic effort being made in India to combat gender-based violence. So while we're talking about players on gender-based violence, what are the key stakeholders and player? Sarah, can you tell me some more information on what are some of the key organizations working in this area?
Certainly. So one that I would like to highlight is UN Women, and they've been really a big leader in advocacy against GBV. They've been leading the 16 Days campaign, and they work to eliminate the discrimination of violence against women and girls and just empowering women as well. And then another organization is Girls Not Brides. And as we spoke about briefly, child marriage is a form of gender-based violence, and this global partnership it spans more than 550 civil society organizations across 70 countries, and they're really committed to ending child marriage and to enabling girls to live their full potential.
Glad you mentioned that. In fact, I remember a statistic reading that in developing countries, 1 in 7 girls under age of 15 are forced into child marriage. So definitely, I'm very glad that there are organizations working for that. So almost time to end the show, but as we end it, it's really important to remember that ending violence against women starts with empowering women. And we had a show on sustainable development goals last week, and sustainable development goal number 5 talks about ending gender inequity, which is a very important step in ending violence towards women. It's all linked. So would just like to leave with that message. This is all we have for this week. Don't do drugs, as Greg says, and stay healthy, keep smiling, and be healthy and happy.